Hi there, my name is Nelson Lee and this is my CIS 305 screencast assignment number 1. In this screencast, I will go over the database concepts of entities, attributes, and relationships. First up, we have an entity. An entity is like the database equivalent of a noun. An entity can be a person, a place, an object, an event, or even a concept. Here we have two examples of entities. First, we have the customer entity, which falls under the category of person. Next, we have the entity order, which falls under the category of event. Entities drawn in an entity relationship diagram are denoted by a rectangular shape with the entity name in the center. An entity type describes a collection of entities that share common properties and characteristics. Here we have the entity type employee. In this example, the entity type employee provides the user information that data in this entity will be related to an employee, such as an employee number, their name, or address. An entity type is described only once in the database. An entity instance describes the single occurrence of an entity type. In this example, we see two different instances in the entity type employee. An entity type can contain many entity instances. A strong entity is an entity that does not depend on the existence of another entity to exist. Here we have the entity employee, which can stand on its own without the help of any other entity. A strong entity can be identified by the underline of the identifier attribute. In this case, would be the employee ID. As opposed to the strong entity, a weak entity cannot exist without another entity. Here we see that the entity dependent depends on the entity employee, making it the weak entity. A weak entity is denoted by the double line around the entity. An attribute is a property or characteristic of an entity type. Here we can see that each attribute associated to a certain entity type describes a certain characteristic of the entity. Like with student, student ID, name, address, phone, and major, all of these would describe the features of the entity type student. A required attribute is an attribute that has to be present for each entity instance. When we look at the student entity type, student ID, student name, home address, home city, home state, home zip code are all required attributes. All of this information is necessary when identifying an entity instance in the student entity type. An optional attribute, as opposed to a required attribute, may or may not have a present value. Here we see that the only optional attribute would be the student's major. In the first instance, this student has a major, however, in the next instance, this student does not. This depicts an optional attribute. A composite attribute is one that can be broken down into different meaningful components. Here, if we look at the entity type employee, we can see that the attribute employee name can be broken up into employee last name and employee first name. We can also take a look at the employee address attribute, which can also be broken down into street, city, state, and zip. A multi-value attribute is an attribute that can take on more than one value for a given entity. Here we can see that the attribute skill under the entity employee can be a multi-attribute. Employees can have more than one skill in the company. A multi-value attribute can be identified by its set of curly brackets. A derived attribute is an attribute whose data isn't generally given, however can be calculated using related data from other attributes. Here we can see that the derived attribute years employed can be calculated using the date of employment attribute and the current date to calculate the years employed for a certain employee. A derived attribute can be categorized by its set of brackets. A relationship type describes the interaction between one or more instances of entity types. A relationship is shown by a line that connects interacting entities. Here we see the interaction between the entity type employee and the entity type course, where the relationship is labeled complete, signifying training courses that employees may take. A relationship instance is an association between entity instances where each relationship instance associates with one entity instance from each participating entity type. In the example, we can see that the line drawn from one employee to a course. This signifies one relationship instance. So the employee Chen has an entity relationship instance with the course C++. The degree of a relationship simply states the number of entity types that participate in a relationship. Degrees can be broken up into unary, binary, and ternary relationship types. A unary relationship is a relationship between the instances of a single entity. As you can see in the example, the relationship line leads back to the same single entity. This is also known as a recursive relationship. A binary relationship is a relationship between the instances of two entity types. In the example, we see that a department can contain a minimum of one to maximum many employees, whereas employees can only belong to one department. A ternary relationship is a simultaneous relationship among the instances of three entity types. Here we can see the three different entity types being vendor, part, and warehouse. A vendor will ship her parts to the warehouse to be stored. Cardinality constraint specifies the number of instances an entity can be associated with another entity instance. A minimum cardinality states the minimum number of instances an entity may be associated with another entity. This is depicted by marking the furthest away from the associated entity. So in the example provided, the minimum cardinality for the entity movie is 1, as depicted by the single vertical line, and the minimum entity for DVD is 0, as depicted by the circle. The same holds true for maximum cardinality, where it states the maximum number of instances an entity may be associated with another entity, and that is depicted by the marking closest to the associated entity. So for the entity movie, that would also be 1, as depicted by the single vertical slash. But for DVD, the max would be many, as depicted by the three-pronged crow's-like feet. So in this relationship, the minimum a movie is stocked as a DVD is 0, and the max is many. And the minimum that a DVD is stocked as a movie is 1, and the max is also 1. An associative entity is an entity type that associates the instance of one or more entity types and contains attributes that are peculiar to the relationship between the entity instances. Associated entities are depicted as a rectangle with round edges. Associated entities are created to break up many-to-many relationships. That concludes the screencast assignment number 1 for CIS 305. I hope you enjoyed it.